Going ahead and signing a guy like Barry, never mind the other signings they made, including Kyle Turris on free agency day, that kind of forced the Oilers' hands in the goalie department as well, because rumor was they were hot after and in the running for Jacob Markstrom, who would have commanded a big salary, and then we wouldn't have a Tyson Barrie in Edmonton.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's interesting how the pieces will fall and how they fall into place, because you're right. If they had signed Markstrom to whatever he was looking for, 7 years, $6 million a year, they wouldn't have had the money for Barrie. And then that would have been a huge hole on the back end for the Oilers to fill, especially if Klefbom couldn't play. You could say things worked out. Now, you look at their goaltending situation. They wanted to upgrade their goaltending situation, which every guy wants to do every year. But I think the situation here was their goaltending wasn't too bad during the regular season. They had the two guys had stretches where they played really well, and it just fell off the map in the 4-game playoffs. And I think you can't really judge the goaltending on those 4 games, because with the exception of McDavid and Draisaitl, Nugent Hopkins, the rest of the team was bad. Like, everyone else was bad on that team. They just didn't do the small things that you need to win in the playoffs. They're going up against a really playoff savvy team in the Blackhawks with a lot of guys that had been in those battles, been in those wars, knew what it was like. And I know, and a lot of people said going into a 5-game series with the Blackhawks was kind of scary, because that's a pretty playoff savvy team. And they didn't get the big goaltending, and it started off with Mike Smith had a terrible opening game of the series and then kind of led from there. But throughout the regular season, if you look at their numbers throughout the regular season, they did enough to get the Oilers into a playoff position and into challenging for that division lead. So if they can do that again, I think the Oilers will be fine. They'll be better defensively just based on experience, because all those guys on the back end will be a year older, a year more experience. I expect Bear to be better. I expect Nurse to be better. I expect a lot of those guys to be better. Russell's going into the last year of his contract, so every time you go into a contract year, there's motivation there. I know that they wanted an upgrade. They didn't get an upgrade, but sometimes when you just don't have that money to spend, you have to go with what you have. Even at the beginning, Ken Holland said, I wouldn't be adverse to signing Mike Smith again. He had a bad playoff game, and Koskinen didn't play much better coming in relief. But I think throughout the course of the regular season, I think those guys did a pretty good job.
Another thing you have to balance off too in your Ken Holland, and you've been mentioning it, is how are your existing players, particularly your younger ones coming up, how have they matured, and what will they bring next season? Because you're right, they will be a year older. They've had that experience, albeit just 4 games in the qualifying round, but it's still playoff hockey. It's still an experience you have to go through. It's a learning experience for absolutely everybody, whether you win or you lose, the way the Oilers did to the 12th seeded Blackhawks when you're the 5th seeded team themselves. When it comes to the Oilers goaltending situation long term, clearly Koskinen and Smith are short term. There's nothing in the system coming up. I mean, Stuart Skinner is probably their top ranked prospect on the goaltending side. But, to expect him to be the next guy, I don't think we even know that yet.
No, and I think that's the problem. And I think that's why the Oilers were hoping the Russian goalie would fall to him in the draft, right, because they would have taken him up, and he came close. But they don't have goaltending coming up in their system. And you look at the goaltenders that they had, they looked at their goaltending and they said, no, we need someone else. We need someone else to bring in. And they went and got Anton Forsberg. And so Anton Forsberg is essentially an AHL goalie that they're hoping, if in an emergency basis they have to bring someone up from the American Hockey League, it'll be a 27-year-old Anton Forsberg as opposed to a 22-year-old Stuart Skinner, because they don't think Skinner's ready yet. They think they still have to develop. And that's the situation. When you draft a goalie, it takes about 4, 5, 6 years to kind of really develop him. You look back at Devin Dubnyk and his development, and it took him a while to get to the league, and then it took him a while to become an all-star goaltender in the league. And by the time he did that, he wasn't even with the Oilers anymore. So it's tough when you draft goalies. You have to have them in your system because you have to bring them through. It's also at the same time you have to be patient with them, and you have to let them develop, and you have to let them grow. And I think that's what the Oilers are trying to do with their goaltenders right now. This is a short-term solution because I think this is it for Mike Smith. I don't see him coming back next year. I think the Oilers will have to make some sort of move. They'll have to find some goaltender somewhere to be their starter for the next few years moving forward. And Koskinen still has a couple years left on his contract, so hopefully he can develop into the goaltender that they saw, because there was a small sample size and they gave him a big contract. And I think they took a gamble, and now they're really going to have to see if that gamble pays off for them.
And when it comes to Koskinen, and even Smith too, even though Smith is, at the end, near the end of his career, not the beginning. I always think of quarterbacks as goalies being like quarterbacks in football. It takes years for them to get into the groove and establish themselves. It doesn't work out exactly the same way. It's not unusual to have a goalie playing well into his 30s. I mean, Corey Crawford being one guy right now, 36 years old, still able to go and find another job, even though the Blackhawks let him go. Countless of examples over time. I mean, I think about Dwayne Rolison as well as a recent example of a goalie who played well into his 40s. So when it comes to Koskinen, who's 30, is he 31?
I think he's 30. I think 31 or 32. Actually, 31 or 32, I believe.
Because, with the regular season we had, not talking about the qualifying round, not a good round for a lot of players. Koskinen had a good season. If you have a 32-year-old Mikko Koskinen you have to lean on as your starter in a couple of years, let's say, hey, he's worth the money we paid for him and you could re-sign him to a contract. That's not the worst thing.
No, it's not. And to be honest, you're right. He's 32 years old and he had really good numbers during the regular season. And to be honest, it was his first season as a starter, as the number one guy. And so that's also a role that you have to develop in. You have to be basically consistent every night when you're the starter. You can't have nights off. And I think for the most part, Koskinen did that last year. When he came in his first year, he was sharing the net with Cam Talbot. And Cam Talbot was the starter and Koskinen was the backup. So he took over that starter's role towards the middle of the season and on towards late. So I think it's a thing where, one, Koskinen has to prove that he can play in the league, which I think he did. I think he proved he can play in this league. I think he proved he can be a number one goaltender in this league. Now it's just a matter of, can you play 50, 60 games? And I think that's, in this day and age, that's a lot of hockey. So a lot of teams do go with two goaltenders. And I think the situation is basically the Oilers are confident in Koskinen's abilities, but I think they wanted someone else there, to really help. If you need to take the ball and run with it, take the ball and run with it. Now, when it comes to Mike Smith did have good stretches last season, but I think he's a goaltender, and you brought up Dwayne Rolison. Dwayne Rolison didn't play much before turning 30. He was kind of a career backup before he got to the Oilers, and he was a guy that said, I don't have a lot of miles on me, so I feel like I'm a fresh 30, 32, 33-year-old goaltender that can extend his career. Mike Smith played a lot of hockey when he was younger. He was counted on a lot when he was in his days in Arizona, so he does have a lot of miles on him. But you have to see, you have to wonder how far can he go? Would he be good to kind of spell off and play every third or fourth night, or can he play every other night if Koskinen gets hurt? And I think that's the situation right now, is that the Oilers are hoping that their goaltending stays steady the way it is right now, because they don't have a lot of room for one of these guys to go down, and hoping the other guy just takes and plays every night, because obviously they don't have a third goaltender.
You already brought up his name, Cam Talbot. He signs with the Minnesota Wild, and you bring up Devin Dubnyk, who is the incumbent there. Obviously, Cam Talbot was the starting goalie for the Oilers for a relatively short period of time. The Oilers acquiring him from the Rangers, this is a few years ago already. But, there's a guy who hasn't been leaned on the way Smith has been the last decade plus with Arizona and with the Oilers and the Flames. But, before that, too, you think about Mike Smith's age. He came up a lot the same way as most goalies. He wasn't a starter, at age 20. He did his time, in Tampa and Dallas, being the backup to Marty Turco in Dallas. This is years ago, until he was able to grab the starter's role with the Coyotes. And who knows, maybe Cam Talbot in the future, considering what he's shown in the past, it's obviously he was the goalie the Flames relied on in the playoffs. Obviously, it was the goalie when the Oilers were in the playoffs in 2017. He was the starting goalie. So who knows? Maybe with Minnesota, because Devin Dubnyk is getting up there in age as well. Maybe that'll be his chance. Yeah,
and sometimes you need a change of scenery for a goaltender that helps to play in front of or behind other defenses. And Minnesota is, she's going to be a pretty good defensive team. I don't think they have a lot of goal scorers on that roster, so they're going to have to keep everything pretty tight. And I think that's going to help a guy like Cam Talbot. Devin Dubnyk, he's a talented goaltender. He had great years in Minnesota, and then for whatever reason, he struggled. And once he struggled, he lost that starting spot. He didn't play in the playoffs for the Wild. So probably a change of scenery will help him out as well. But that's just the way the goaltending carousel works. And you're right. You don't have a lot of carry prices. You don't have a lot of guys that can step in and play at a young age and be that star goaltender that they are. And I think even with Carey Price, they went and got him some help because they were relying on him a little too much in Montreal. So they got him some help, and now they're spending a lot of money on goaltending in Montreal. But that's just the way it evolves, and goaltending is a position that, yeah, sometimes it gets better with age, and it's not necessarily about being a young guy with a lot of mobility. It's about being able to read the game and read situations and just being in the right place at the right time. So it's interesting this year how many goaltenders switch places and how much the movement was with goalies. And I think a lot of teams are realizing now that you don't have to draft and develop your own guy. You can go out there and get someone else's number two, and all they need is sometimes is an opportunity, is a chance. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now with teams.